There are friendships the world watches from a distance, admiring the smiles, the photographs, the public moments of warmth. And then there are friendships that live in the spaces between the headlines, in whispered phone calls, in private grief, in letters that should never have been sent, and in silences that stretched far too long. The bond between Elton John and Princess Diana was both of these things at once. It was one of the most iconic friendships of the 20th century, and yet its most important chapters happened entirely out of the public eye. For years, the world only saw pieces of it. The laughing pair at charity galas. The image of Diana leaning toward a weeping Elton at Gianni Versace's funeral. The devastating notes of Candle in the Wind drifting through Westminster Abbey on a cold September morning. But behind every one of those moments was a story far more complicated, more painful, and more human than any newspaper ever captured. Now, through his autobiography, interviews, and candid revelations over the years, Elton John has finally laid bare the truth about how it all began, what it truly meant, where it broke, and how it found its way back together just in time for the most devastating ending imaginable. The year was 1981, and Britain was swept up in the spectacle of a royal wedding. Prince Charles was set to marry a young woman named Diana Spencer, and the country could talk of little else. But inside Windsor Castle, at a party celebrating Prince Andrew's 21st birthday, something quietly extraordinary was about to happen. Elton John had been invited to perform that evening, playing alongside percussionist Ray Cooper in the castle's ballroom. He was already one of the most famous musicians on the planet, and yet, as he later described, there was something inherently awkward about navigating the stiff formality of royal gatherings. He had been introduced to the royal family years earlier, first through Princess Margaret, who adored music and had invited him to dinner at Kensington Palace in the 1970s. But royal events, no matter how glamorous, had a way of making even the most confident performer feel slightly out of place. That night at Prince Andrew's party, however, everything shifted. Before long, Elton found himself on the dance floor alongside Princess and even Queen Elizabeth II herself, all of them grooving to Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, the Queen clutching her handbag as she danced. It was, as Elton later wrote, a scene that defied all expectations of royal behavior. Then Diana arrived. She had not yet become a princess. She was still Diana Spencer, young, luminous, and possessed of a quality that Elton would later struggle to put into adequate words. In his autobiography, Me, published in 2019, he described her as someone blessed with an extraordinary social ease, a rare ability to make absolutely anyone feel comfortable in her presence. From the very first moment their eyes met across that ballroom, something clicked. Within minutes, they were laughing together like old friends, making fun of the stiff, feeble music playing around them. They ended up doing an exaggerated mock Charleston together in the middle of the dance floor, completely unscripted and entirely ridiculous, and somewhere nearby, the Queen herself reportedly noticed and smiled. It was the beginning of everything. Elton would later say that he felt, from that very first night, as though he had always known her. And in a way, they were cut from similar cloth. Both were outsiders operating within worlds that demanded performance and perfection. Both understood the weight of being constantly watched and constantly judged. He was a flamboyant rock star whose private life was endlessly scrutinized. She was a young woman about to surrender her freedom entirely to one of the most rigid institutions in the world. Neither of them fit neatly into the boxes that had been built around them, and that unspoken understanding became the invisible thread that would hold their friendship together for the next 16 years. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Elton John and Princess Diana became part of each other's lives in ways that went far beyond the headline-friendly moments the cameras captured. They appeared together at major events, backstage at the 1985 Live Aid concert, at royal charity galas, at fundraisers. They were photographed, written about, and celebrated as an unlikely but compelling pairing. But what the photographs couldn't capture was the substance beneath the smiles. Diana, as Elton described her repeatedly, was one of the most genuinely warm and profoundly indiscreet people he had ever known. She was, in his own words from his memoir, fabulous company, the finest dinner guest he could imagine, someone who would tell you anything if you simply asked. She had a gift for making people feel that the walls had come down entirely, that in her presence there was no hierarchy and no pretense. She teased him relentlessly about his extravagant wardrobe choices. He admired her ability to disarm even the most self-important room with a single smile. But their friendship was not built entirely on laughter. It was built on recognition, the recognition of two people who understood what it felt like to be enormously visible and profoundly lonely at the same time. By the mid-1980s, Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was deteriorating rapidly. The fairy tale the world had been sold was quietly crumbling behind palace walls. Reports of emotional distance, infidelity, and despair were beginning to leak into public consciousness, and Diana was privately struggling with the suffocating weight of royal life. She battled bulimia, sleepless nights, and a deep sense of isolation within an institution that prioritized duty over humanity. She once told friends that she felt as though the palace treated her feelings as an inconvenience rather than a reality. Elton understood that particular kind of loneliness. Behind the glittering costumes and the sold-out stadiums, he was waging his own private war against addiction, self-doubt, and the punishing demands of sustained global fame. He would later describe that period of his life as one of the most difficult stretches he endured, a time when the outside world saw only the spectacle while the interior reality was considerably darker. They saw each other clearly and without judgment. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was what made their friendship rare. One of the things that drew them even closer was their shared passion for AIDS awareness during an era when the disease was shrouded in stigma, fear, and deliberate ignorance. In a world where even many prominent figures avoided any association with AIDS advocacy for fear of what it might imply about them, Diana stood in hospital wards and held the hands of patients without gloves, looked them in the eyes, and treated them as human beings deserving of dignity. Elton would later say that this single gesture changed public perception of the disease forever. To him, it revealed the full measure of her courage. She didn't operate from a position of calculation or image management. She operated from the heart, every single time. He, meanwhile, had lost dear friends to AIDS and had thrown himself into advocacy and fundraising through the Elton John AIDS Foundation. In a BBC interview, he reflected on what Diana's involvement had meant to that cause. For someone within the royal family, a woman, a heterosexual woman, to stand visibly beside people the world had largely abandoned was nothing short of transformative. It gave permission to a nation to feel compassion where before there had been fear. Not all of their shared memories were weighted with sorrow. Some were simply, wonderfully absurd. Elton was a witness to what he came to think of as the Diana effect, the extraordinary and somewhat baffling power she had over men, particularly men who considered themselves among the most powerful and magnetic figures on the planet. He described it in his autobiography with evident amusement. At one memorable private dinner party he hosted, both Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone were among the guests, along with a very single Princess of Wales. What followed was, by Elton's account, one of the most peculiar evenings of his social life. Gere and Diana quickly gravitated toward each other, settling in front of the fireplace in deep and apparently captivating conversation. Stallone, watching from across the room, grew visibly and increasingly unhappy about this development. The atmosphere turned strange. Words were exchanged. Stallone eventually left in a fury, having reportedly announced his displeasure in terms too colorful to fully reproduce in polite company. Throughout all of it, Diana remained entirely composed, either genuinely unaware of the chaos unfolding around her or simply too accustomed to this kind of effect to register much surprise. Elton observed her with equal parts affection and astonishment. Here were two of Hollywood's most bankable leading men, very nearly coming to blows, and she sat in the middle of it all with the serenity of someone waiting for a perfectly ordinary evening to resume. It was, he would later note, something he had never quite forgotten. By the mid-1990s, the friendship had deepened into something that resembled family. They argued and joked and relied on one another in the way that only truly close relationships allow. But in 1996, something went badly wrong. Elton had been working on a coffee table book called Rock and Royalty, a collaboration with his close friend and fashion designer Gianni Versace. The book was a lavish photography collection, and all proceeds were directed toward the Elton John AIDS Foundation. Diana had agreed to write the foreword, a meaningful gesture from someone of her standing, a signal to the world that this cause deserved its attention and its compassion. Then, without warning, she withdrew. The reason that came back through official channels was that she had not been fully aware of the book's contents, that it included photographs of semi-nude male models alongside royal family images, and that this combination was considered inappropriate for a member of the royal family to be associated with. Elton, who had shown her the entire book and received her enthusiastic approval, found this explanation impossible to accept. He later wrote in his memoir that he believed the real pressure came from Buckingham Palace, which had decided the association was not suitable. He was furious. Not simply because of the lost forward, but because of what the withdrawal cost the foundation in terms of both revenue and credibility. He wrote to Diana directly, reminding her that she had seen the book, that she had approved it, and that her withdrawal had done real financial damage to a cause they both believed in. What came back was a letter that began, as he later recalled, with the words "Dear Mr. John," formal, cold, and as distant as if it had been written to a stranger rather than a friend of 15 years. He was, in his own words, angry. Deeply, genuinely angry. And so they stopped speaking. For months, there was silence between them, the kind of heavy silence that comes not from indifference but from wounded pride. In interviews years later, Elton admitted that he could have been the one to pick up the phone. He acknowledged that he hadn't, that they were both too proud, and that the waiting had become a kind of stubbornness neither of them seemed able to break. He also expressed something more complex than simple anger, genuine worry. He had noticed, in the period leading up to their falling out, that Diana had begun to pull away from people who had always been honest with her, the friends who would tell her difficult truths rather than comfortable ones. She seemed, in his observation, to be increasingly surrounding herself with people who would simply agree with her, validate her, and reflect back whatever she wished to see. From his own hard-won experience with addiction and recovery, he understood the particular danger of that kind of insulation. He worried about her, even while he was still furious with her. It took a murder to bring them back together. On the morning of July 15, 1997, the fashion designer Gianni Versace was shot and killed outside his Miami Beach home by serial killer Andrew Cunanan. The news shook the worlds of fashion, entertainment, and celebrity to their foundations. Versace had been a central figure in both Elton and Diana's lives, a friend, a creative collaborator, a man of enormous warmth and generosity who had built a kind of chosen family around him. Somehow, Diana got hold of Elton's phone number in Nice, where he was staying, a number she should not have had, at a home he had not owned for long. She called. And when she did, the months of cold silence dissolved in seconds. She told him she was sorry. She said it had been a silly falling out. She said she wanted to be friends again.